This is table 3-3. We'll cover the vertebrae, sacrum and coccyx.
So we're just going to go over the first part of the table, which is the typical vertebrae. A lot of them, you can see that we've got different, like slightly different shapes as we go further down the spine. So we're just gonna go over the basic terms for this. When we start, we have this part right here that the pipe cleaner is covering. This is called your lamina. So this is going to connect these transverse processes with your spinous process. So it's just that section right there. And then next we have the pedicle, which that's this section. So here we have the transverse process and the pedicle. So right here is also the pedicle. I remember this one because it sounds like a pedal, and when you pedal a bike, it's pretty close to your body. We went over transverse process. These are going to stick out transversely from the vertebrae. Our spinous process is right here. This is what you're actually going to feel if you feel your spine. So if you run your fingers along that pointed part, you wouldn't want this sticking inside of you because then you're going to puncture a bunch of organs. So that will always go outside. It's going to point posteriorly. We have our articular processes and facets. So that is these right here. Our articular processes, so that is this part that's sticking up. So that's the pointed part specifically. And facet means face. So that's going to be this part right here. So what is going to happen is when you add another vertebrae, you're going to have them touch. They're going to articulate. So the facet is going to articulate with another vertebrae. Then we have the vertebral foramen, which that is this hole right there. So this is actually what your spinal nerves are going to go through.
Spinal cord.
Spinal cord, sorry. Then we've got the body, that's this big part. On your quizzes, make sure to label the body of the vertebrae because we've got lots of bones with different structures titled body. And then the intervertebral discs, that is this part right here. This is in between each one of your vertebrae. This is what is going to help it so your spine can move back and forth. This is not bone though, this is going to be cartilage. If you have a, it's fibrocartilage and it's found just adjacently. So, and then we have intervertebral foramen. That is these holes right here. These holes can only be seen when you have two vertebrae that actually connect together. So you see you just have just one vertebrae, you can see half of where that hole would be, that intervertebral foramen. When you put them together, that's when you'll see that full hole. So the difference between the different vertebrae, first we've got our cervical. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, and these look a little bit different. You can see how they have the transverse foramen right there. That is going to hold your cervical nerves to get to your skull. And everything's still named the same. So we still have your spinous process and your lamina and your transverse processes, but just remember that if it has these transverse foramen, that is specifically a cervical vertebrae.
We also have our vertebral artery and vein that run through those holes with some nerves, which are important to learn later.
And then our very first vertebrae, we have these two, and these, there's only one of each of them. This one is our atlas, and this is our axis. And the axis has this prominent point, and this is called your odontoid process, or dens. And when you put them together, your atlas is going to be able to rotate around that. And then we have our vertebral prominence, and that's this part right there.
I think it's also important to note for the atlas, the axis, the odontoid process sticks up superiorly, so that's pretty easy to know that these are your superior articular facets. But on the atlas, it's not as easy to tell. So you can see how one side has a very curved out facet, and then the other side has a very flat facet. And as Suzette showed you, you definitely want the flat side to articulate with the top of the axis. Therefore, so our curved out ends would be our superior articular facets, because those would articulate with our, if you remember, our occipital condyles around the foramen magnum, which is very rounded. But the inferior articular facets would be very flat, because those have to articulate with the superior articular facet on the axis. So on the atlas, make sure you realize the curved one would be superior, the flat one would be inferior.
Then we have the difference between our thoracic and our lumbar. So right here, these are going to be our thoracic vertebrae, and this is going to be our lumbar. And I tell the difference by, first, the thoracic, it looks more like a giraffe head, and the lumbar looks like a moose. So when you put them on the table, the lumbar spinous process doesn't actually touch the table, but the thoracic spinous process is going to.
And again, like the atlas, you're also going to want to look at our superior and inferior articular processes. So on the thoracic, you can see pretty clearly that the superior articular facets are very much in the frontal plane, and they're facing posterior, because this is posterior, so they are facing posterior, and then the inferior are very much facing anterior. Whereas the lumbar vertebrae, if you notice, the superior articular facets and process are actually facing inward towards the medial view here. And then the inferior are actually facing lateral or outward. So very different facets, and that has to do with how the body moves. If I come show you the spine, which Suzette's gonna be in the way, I think. Sorry. But if you notice, lumbar has a lot of stability based on how those facets are facing, whereas our thoracic vertebrae, you get a lot of flexion with that because you can move forward and give that vertebrae, it will move on top and glide over each other. But that lumbar, I mean, it's really, we don't want it to move much at all there. And so by the way that those are facing, they keep it really together.
So the last part of this is our sacrum, and this is after our lumbar. So this is the very bottom. So this is our sacrum with our coccyx at the end. The sacrum, we have the anterior sacral foramen, or foramina. So this, you really have to orient yourself. So this is going to be our anterior sacral foramina. That's these holes. And then if we turn it around, this is our posterior. So if you think about this in your body, I remember I had said that the spinous processes are going to point out posteriorly, and this is going to be inside. So the anterior portion is the smoother section. If you are referring to just one hole, it will be foramen. So the anterior sacral foramen, or the posterior sacral foramen, but multiple is foramina. And it is a little bit confusing because the same hole will have two different names depending on which side you're on. So make sure you orient yourself with that. The median sacral crest is this right there. So that's just, it kind of looks like the spine if you keep going down. The auricular surface,
is our outer ear portion. So auricular means ear. So it's really this portion right here, and it's not the whole side. If we look at a different one here, it's not the entire thing, it's just the smooth part that is on it. So here and here, and then I'll show you an even different one. So right here, it's just this smoother part on that rough surface. So, excuse me. So just to kind of show you the angle there, we're looking at this outer part. And that's going to also meet up with the auricular surface of the os coxa.
Then we have our superior articular processes. And that's going to be just like how we talked about. We've got, well, that doesn't really match up, but if we had a bigger lumbar vertebrae, it's going to match up right there. And these processes just right here to match up with the lumbar vertebrae. So just like got the, it would be the facet, but I don't think you have that.